Part 8. The nature of proletarian control.
The proletariat taking control of the forces of production would transform the nature of society as a whole. However, it would be mistaken to try to predict exactly how the world would be different then. Revolution by definition changes the terms of social life, so what is possible, what is necessary, and what remains a matter of contingent choice and action is fundamentally different from what they were before such predictions came into existence. Mikhail Bakunin was perhaps being hyperbolic, but he was not wrong when he claimed that anyone who makes plans for after the revolution is a reactionary. So instead of predictions, Marx sets out a very simple presupposition for socialism. This is that socialism will be characterized by collective property. This is by no means the only necessary characteristic of socialism, of course, but it is one that makes an especially stark contrast with the capitalist status quo. So how would collective property change the world? Any reference to property in the context of a capitalist society is easy to misinterpret, especially by inadvertently carrying bourgeois notions of property into a better future. There are, in general, three basic social relations of production that, taken together with the prevailing forces of production, define a mode of production. Of these, the first is the relation that determines who controls the means of production. In the capitalist world, the answer is generally that the capitalist class exercises its authority, i.e., its socially legitimate power, over the means of production through the personal and private ownership of capital. Personal ownership is often obscured by the fact that direct ownership of many forces of production is in corporate hands, not only individual businesses, but also yet more indirectly via asset managers, investment banks, family trusts, pension funds, insurance companies, and so on. But ultimately, even these faceless institutions are owned by real human beings, the so-called beneficial owners. Leaving aside the question of the very large forces of production under the control of the state and other superstructural organizations, the upshot of this system of private ownership is that bourgeois property tends to defeat all attempts to exercise social control. This is for two fundamental reasons. Firstly, private property is exclusive to the individual and only open to social interference or even regulation in the most extreme circumstances. So much so that in some jurisdictions, the privacy of private property is a constitutional right. As John Adams, founding father, co-author of the Declaration of Independence and an important influence over the US Constitution, put it,
"If all were to be decided by a vote of the majority, the 8 or 9 millions who have no property would not think of usurping over the rights of the 1 or 2 millions who have. Debts would be abolished first, taxes laid heavy on the rich and not at all on the others, and at last a downright equal division of everything be demanded and voted. The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. If 'thou shalt not covet' and 'thou shalt not steal' were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free."
But Adams was writing in 1787, in the pre-industrial era, when the principal alternative to bourgeois property was the arbitrary anti-democratic power of monarchy, and, in Europe, various forms of residual feudal authority. In that context, the sanctity of personal and private property was a valuable advance in human liberty. In the mature industrial period, however, when private property consists of the means to dominate huge swathes of one's fellow citizens, its effects can be catastrophic, and it is essential to the viability not only of society, but of nature, that it be under democratic control. Secondly, the rights of ownership that are guaranteed by private property are completely dissociated from practical participation in productive activity. Not only does the owner of capital play no direct role in production, at least not by virtue of that ownership, but the fact that all surplus value accrues to the owners of capital in the form of profits, rent and interest ensures that they grow wealthy without any effort at all. They benefit from the immense productivity of capitalism by virtue of a relation to capital that is specifically unproductive. So under capitalist relations of production, ownership is signified not by active, personal, involvement in production, but rather by share certificates, deeds of property, and legal contracts of different kinds. Like all other products of capitalism, these shares, bonds, and the like are commodities, and as such defined by the absence of any but the most external possible relationship to the thing owned. They are bought and sold, neither purchase nor sale creating any but the most formal relationship to the objects of this activity: companies, materials, machines, products, organizations, and so on. In short, private property in the means of capitalist production is the alter ego not of effort, skill, collaboration, and responsibility, and absolutely not of a vision or aspiration for one's fellow human beings, but of money. Its abiding aim is not the enrichment of producers or humanity generally, but the preservation of an alien world of wealth, comfort, and indulgence belonging exclusively to the few. This world is fundamentally dissociated from society as a whole, yet it is the hub around which society orbits and to whose gravitational pull it is subordinated. Such formal instruments of ownership are not necessary for property as such. There was no need for share certificates in the early agricultural commune where communal property prevailed, but only where there's no obvious reason why those who own should be the owners, as opposed to those who actually create and work the forces of production. Under capital, of course, they are excluded from their own natural right of ownership by their alienation from the means of production and by this precedence of formality over substance. However, every aspect of ownership would be abolished as soon as the proletariat recognized that, in practice and in substance, if not yet in terms of conventional wisdom or legal right, they already control the means of production. In particular, the right to buy and sell the company, the essential right of private property, of course, would disappear. No one would own the organization in that sense, not even its workers. Individuals entering the organization would acquire democratic rights over its decision-making, and individuals leaving would lose them. And this democratic right would itself reflect the active participation in the organization. In a word, the organization would not operate correctly or effectively without that individual's efforts, so their withdrawal of the same effort would require that their views be attended to. This is, of course, the non-alienated form of the strike. The workers withdraw their labour when they are dissatisfied with the organisation's operations. In the case of the capitalist corporation, this withdrawal creates an antithesis with management. In a socialist economy, it would merely represent a momentary pause while the relevant issues were disputed and agreed. So ownership, in any bourgeois sense, would be dissolved along with capitalism as a whole. Conversely, the historical defence of the bourgeoisie, the notion that there is an intrinsic legitimacy to their ownership of and authority over the forces and relations of production, collapses as soon as the proletariat recognises that it is they, and not the owners or their representatives, who create everything they have always been told that the bourgeoisie contributes to capitalism: strategy, investment, direction, and the rest, all flowing magically from the ineffable genius of the so-called wealth creator. Now, thanks to the development of capitalism itself, it is the proletariat who devise, implement, and supervise the strategies, investment plans, and work programs on which all production rests, and who conceive the need for, design, build, and operate the mass of fixed capital, machines, organization, knowledge, that has for so long threatened their livelihoods. In every respect, except for formal legal right, capital belongs to them, not to the capitalist. Of course, we have been here before. This recognition that employers are not in reality the uniquely competent wealth creators, but rather primarily the representatives of private property, with perhaps a few useful skills attached, is, I think, analogous to the change that overtook the class of British domestic servants before and after the First World War. That is, amidst the rise of an organised working class generally and a long rearguard action by successive British governments, domestic servants came to see themselves not so much as owing service to middle and upper-class masters, as being merely employed by them. With all the differences in attitude, practical options, life chances and so on that followed. So the servant class went from a quasi-feudal relationship to their superiors to a properly bourgeois relation to their formal equals. Of course, the entire subsequent history of working and middle classes alike has consisted of discovering that this formal equality though by no means a falsehood, was something of a trick. They continue to be exploited, now without the cover of this sense of duty, but still needing to penetrate the smokescreen of surplus value, which they alone create, and without which capitalism itself would collapse. Nevertheless, as an emerging proletariat discovers its own strengths and recognizes its own accomplishments, they come to see themselves not as merely subordinate employees, but as the true creators of society's wealth, and therefore as fully and uniquely entitled to appropriate what they have created. The remaining step, the actual act of appropriation, remains to be executed. But before that can happen, above all, the proletariat must realize that the abstract forms of capital, essentially the money and forms of fictitious capital such as shares, on which capitalists previously rested their claim to control, via share ownership, by investing in the corporation, by buying up corporate bonds and so on, are in fact only rights to the surplus value created by the proletariat's own efforts in previous cycles of production. The capitalist has capital to invest only because they previously took the surplus value created by the joint efforts of the working and middle classes in the previous cycles of production and sale. That is what capitalism is, a system for funneling the accomplishments of one class into the bank accounts of another. But of course, this realization cannot come about until the proletariat are and know themselves to be one class, and therefore not before there is a proletariat properly so called. For that to happen, the whole range of producers, direct and indirect, working class and middle class, must be organized into a single echelon that is capable of recognizing not only its own nature, but also its own position vis-à-vis the world of property, from which it has previously been firmly excluded. Armed with this new understanding, capitalist ownership is revealed to be a fiction, so to speak, from which the real wealth creators, the direct and indirect producers of value, now liberate themselves by appropriating for themselves the real capital. This fictitious capital camouflages. This is why the proletariat will carry out their revolution not from outside, as have perhaps all previous revolutionaries, but from within. In practical terms, the machines, the organizations, the materials, the expertise, the supply chains, the systems of energy, communication and transport, the shops and supermarkets are all already theirs, their creations and at their practical day-to-day disposal, and wait only for the proletariat to recognize this fact in conscious theory, so to speak, and so take full control of them. With that, the division of labor that for so long summoned classes into existence and set them at each other's throats is subsumed by, on the one hand, a mass of fixed capital that instantiates humanity's most essential capabilities and highest technical achievements, but in a form that is only sustainable by collective production, and on the other, a shared consciousness that human society is a unified totality in which all have an equal interest and to which all make an equivalent contribution, i.e., the contribution of which they are capable. On the other hand, the direct control the proletariat exercise through their personal experience of production as a collective endeavor binding production into a rational totality means that it is no longer necessary, or even realistically possible, to partition ownership of the economic whole into billions of lots, shares, through which private control can be exercised and profit extracted. It is the machines they direct together, based on plans drawn up together as to what they collectively decide to make, that constitute a socialist economy. With that, the panoply of superstructures on which class society depends dissolves, not because all dilemmas have magically disappeared from life or there is no further need for special-purpose vehicles, but because they are confronted by human beings finally unified in their most fundamental interests, and no longer in need of a web of fragmented and mutually opposed institutions through which to mediate the once ceaseless conflict and misunderstanding. With that,
society which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers will put the whole machinery of state where it will then belong, into the Museum of Antiquities by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe.
With that, the great division of the economic, the social production of goods and services, from the rest of society that has plagued humanity for so many millennia, ceases. In its place comes the freedom of unalienated collective creation of the world we want and need. Thus, in Engels' familiar words, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things. But at least as important are the words that immediately follow, and by the conduct of processes of production. In other words, and here it is impossible to overemphasize the importance of this second phrase, the collective property of the proletariat consists not of formal certificates of socially constructed rights that are separate from real production, but rather the forces of production themselves and the reality of all members of society participating actively in production. With that, the whole notion of property dissolves. In place of rights and privileges, of subordination and exploitation, the economy resolves itself into nothing more than the machines before our very eyes, which we design and make, and we organize ourselves to use. Based on the scientific insight, collective imagination, and democratic decisions we have created. Thus the proletariat supersede the bourgeoisie because they realize that, thanks to the self-development of capitalism as a whole, that is already how the world works. The proletariat already control the means of production, while the relations of production of private ownership and employment are unsustainable. If a more philosophical justification is required than the material demands of the real world, it is suitably ironic that the key argument an organized and self-conscious proletariat advances to justify their seizure of the corporation could well be the very argument bourgeois colonists applied to the lands they stole from their existing inhabitants. They argued that indigenous peoples weren't making the most of their lands, and that therefore people who would exploit the land more fully, the European bourgeoisie, were entitled to seize them.
Land that is left wholly to nature, that hath no improvement of pasturage, tillage, or planting, is called, as indeed it is, waste, and we shall find the benefit of it amount to little more than nothing.
However, just as the lands colonialists found were being wasted, vacuum domicilium, untilled, uncultivated, unenclosed, so now the bourgeoisie are laying waste to the entire world. The bourgeoisie's ownership of the means of production not only limits the social value that can be derived from them, but also channels them into overwhelmingly destructive pathways. The capitalist imperatives of endless expansion and profit are destroying the planet. The capitalist economy is annihilating the human ecology, and the structure of capitalism means that this destruction cannot be halted while capitalism predominates. Above all, private property in the means of production. So, the proletariat are not only entitled to take over the means of production that define industrial society, but, like the bourgeoisie before them, and with a considerably better grasp of logic, they have a natural right and obligation to do so. Assuming, that is, that they really are able to make better use of them. But the precise rationale for socialism hardly matters. It is, after all, not for present theorists to dictate tactics to future revolutionaries.